Officer Kyle Mitchell cruised through the suburban streets, his patrol car humming steadily, the early autumn chill creeping through the open window. He'd done this countless times, patrolling the same neighborhoods, stopping the same types of cars, questioning the same people. The routine was almost therapeutic, a pattern of predictable events. But as he neared a quiet street corner, something caught his eye. A tall, black man walking down the sidewalk in a crisp suit. The man stood out in this neighborhood. Too clean. Too composed. Mitchell's instincts flared. This was the kind of guy who didn't belong, who could be trouble. Mitchell hit the siren without thinking, the lights flashing red and blue across the pavement. The man didn't flinch, didn't show any signs of alarm. He simply turned his head, his gaze locking with Mitchell's as the officer slowed the car to a stop beside him. "Evening," Mitchell called out as he stepped from the vehicle, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. He looked the man up and down, tall, well-groomed, and undeniably confident. Too confident. Something about him felt wrong, like a quiet storm just waiting to break. "Can I help you, officer?" the man asked, his voice calm, steady, betraying no hint of fear. "You know why I stopped you?" Mitchell asked, his voice flat. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but his gut was telling him something was off. This man didn't look like he belonged. In Mitchell's world, people who didn't fit in were often the ones you needed to watch. The man didn't respond right away, just staring back at Mitchell with an unreadable expression. "No, officer. I don't." Mitchell's jaw tightened. His hand hovered over his holster. He was already getting annoyed. "Let me see your ID." The man reached into his jacket with deliberate slowness, his fingers brushing the wallet inside, as if he didn't have a care in the world. Mitchell's eyes narrowed. This wasn't how people usually acted when they got pulled over. Most people were nervous, fidgeting. This guy was too calm, too collected. "Do you have a reason for stopping me?" the man asked, his voice barely above a whisper, but the sharpness in it made Mitchell bristle. "Just hand over the ID," Mitchell snapped, the authority in his voice tinged with impatience. The man's calm demeanor was starting to get under his skin. The black man didn't flinch, only slowly handed over his ID with an air of quiet defiance. Mitchell grabbed the card, his eyes scanning the name, Agent Samuel Carter, FBI. His breath caught in his throat. For a split second, everything stopped. The man wasn't just some random citizen, he was a federal agent. Mitchell stared at the ID, his pulse quickening. He just pulled over an FBI agent. His stomach dropped. "Agent Carter," Mitchell whispered, his voice faltering as the weight of his mistake hit him. "I didn't know." "Clearly," Carter replied coolly, his eyes never leaving Mitchell's face. "You've made a mistake." Mitchell felt his face flush with heat, a surge of humiliation rising up in him. How could he have been so stupid? This wasn't just a routine stop. He had let his own prejudices take control, and now it was all crashing down around him. "I didn't mean to." Mitchell stammered, his voice shrinking under the weight of the realization. Carter interrupted him, his voice low but commanding. "You've got a lot to learn, officer. You can't let your assumptions guide your actions like that. It could cost you everything." The words stung harder than Mitchell had expected. His chest tightened, his mind racing. He had always prided himself on being in control, but now, standing in front of this man, an FBI agent no less, he was exposed. His bias had led him to make a fatal error, one that could haunt him for the rest of his career. "You should think long and hard about the way you see people," Carter added, his voice steady and unyielding. "Especially when you're the one holding the power." With a final look, Carter turned and walked away, his pace unhurried, his back straight. Mitchell stood frozen, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. He had just been schooled in front of the one person who had every right to call him out, and there was no coming back from this moment. The flashing lights of his patrol car felt distant now, almost like a forgotten relic. He had just learned a brutal lesson in humility, one he wouldn't soon forget. The encounter with Agent Carter had shattered something deep inside Officer Kyle Mitchell. As he stood alone on the curb, watching Carter disappear into the distance, the buzzing of the patrol car's sirens seemed distant, almost irrelevant. He had been exposed, but worse, he had been forced to confront something about himself that he had spent years denying: his own biases. The flashing lights of his car were still pulsing, the colors reflecting off the storefronts, creating an eerie glow on the otherwise quiet street. But the sound of the siren was a dull hum now, like the ringing in his ears after a blow to the head. His heart was still racing, his mind spinning with the realization that he had just made a catastrophic mistake. Mitchell swallowed hard and leaned against his patrol car, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. The cool evening air nipped at his skin, but his skin felt hot under the rush of embarrassment. How had he not seen it? How had he allowed his assumptions to cloud his judgment? He thought he was better than this. He was better than this. But as much as he tried to reason with himself, the truth gnawed at him. He had been wrong, so very wrong, and now there was no easy way to undo the damage. A voice broke through his spiraling thoughts. Mitchell. The sound of his name made him flinch, his body tensing instinctively. He turned to see Officer Linda Harris, his partner, approaching him with a concerned expression. She had been patrolling the area nearby and had caught sight of the scene unfolding. Her eyes shifted from the flashing lights of the car to Mitchell's face, reading the anxiety and discomfort written all over him. "What happened?" she asked, her voice soft, but there was an edge to it. Linda had always been the level-headed one, the one who kept her cool no matter what. But even she couldn't hide the concern in her voice now. Mitchell didn't know how to explain it. He couldn't. Not to her. I messed up," he said, his voice rough, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. The shame was so heavy he wasn't sure how to bear it. "I pulled over a guy, an FBI agent." Linda's eyebrows shot up. She stopped in her tracks, her gaze flickering to the empty street where Carter had walked off. The realization hit her instantly. She took a cautious step closer, her tone shifting to one of quiet disbelief. "An FBI agent? Are you sure?" "Yeah," Mitchell said, his voice hollow. "I didn't know. I thought he was, I don't know, out of place. I wasn't thinking straight. I let my prejudices guide me." He clenched his jaw, the words coming out like bitter pills. "And now he's gone. I can't believe I did that." Linda stood silent for a moment, processing his words. She didn't say anything, just watched him with an intensity that made him feel smaller. He knew she was trying to make sense of it, but what could she possibly say to make this right? Finally she spoke, her voice quieter, more serious. "You should have known better, Kyle. I don't care how much you're used to pulling people over. You should have known better." The words stung, but they were the truth. Linda was right. He should have known better. But there was no time for self-pity now. He had to figure out how to make things right, or at least try. "Do you think he'll report me?" Mitchell asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. He wasn't used to feeling like this, vulnerable, exposed, on the verge of losing control. Linda didn't answer immediately. She glanced at the direction Carter had gone, her expression hardening. "I wouldn't be surprised if he did. You made a serious mistake, Mitchell." The FBI doesn't take stuff like this lightly. The weight of her words hit him like a slap in the face. It wasn't just a mistake. It wasn't just a bad call. This could be the end of his career, the end of everything he had worked for. The reality of it all sank in like quicksand, pulling him deeper with every breath. He had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. And now he had to face the consequences. "Do you think it could get worse?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, his eyes searching Linda's face for any hint of reassurance. She didn't sugarcoat it. "You might get suspended. Maybe worse. If that guy presses charges, or if word gets out, your badge won't be the only thing that's gone." The silence between them stretched long, heavy, suffocating. Mitchell's pulse thundered in his ears, and he could feel the cold sweat starting to bead on his forehead. What had he done? Linda gave him one last look before shaking her head. "I'll cover your back as much as I can. But you have to fix this, Kyle. Only you can fix this." As Linda walked back to her patrol car, Mitchell stood there. He felt the ground beneath him slip away, his world suddenly tilting into a dark abyss. How had he let this happen? He couldn't just go back to the way things were. He couldn't undo the damage. He reached into his pocket, fingers trembling, and pulled out his phone. His hand hovered over the screen for a moment as he debated calling his superior, but the thought of reporting this made him want to vomit. He knew that if he called, it was over. He couldn't go down that road. Not yet. He needed time to think, time to fix what was broken, time to figure out if he could salvage anything. But as he stood there, staring at the screen, his phone vibrated in his hand. A message from an unknown number flashed across the screen. His heart skipped a beat as he opened it. "Agent Carter would like to meet with you tomorrow. 10 a.m. Don't be late." The message was brief, but the weight of it was immense. Mitchell's chest tightened as a fresh wave of dread hit him. Carter hadn't just forgotten about this. He was watching him, waiting for him to come to him. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The reckoning was coming. The next morning felt like an eternity, each passing minute dragging Mitchell deeper into a pit of anxiety. He had barely slept, his mind replaying the events of the night before in a never-ending loop. The hum of his alarm clock was a cruel reminder that he couldn't escape the consequences of his actions. He had already made the call to his superior, Sergeant Hill, and as expected, the conversation had been terse, filled with disapproval. But nothing had prepared him for what was coming. The message from Agent Carter lingered in his mind like a shadow, its meaning heavy and foreboding. "Meet tomorrow, 10 a.m. Don't be late." The words echoed through Mitchell's thoughts as he sat in his patrol car, parked a few blocks away from the coffee shop where the meeting was set to take place. It was a place with a quiet, unassuming atmosphere, perfect for a conversation that could change everything. Mitchell glanced at his watch. 9:58 a.m. His palms were sweating, his grip tight on the steering wheel. He felt like he was about to walk into the lion's den, and the only thing standing between him and the abyss was the thin thread of his own self-control. With a deep breath, he pushed open the car door and stepped into the cool morning air. The world felt sharper, more vivid, as though everything around him was watching, waiting for him to make the wrong move. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being judged with every step he took. The coffee shop was just ahead, the small bell above the door ringing as Mitchell walked in. The familiar scent of brewing coffee hit him first, then his eyes found Carter, sitting in the far corner, his back straight, hands folded neatly in front of him. He didn't look up as Mitchell approached, but Mitchell felt the weight of his gaze, sharp and calculating, as if Carter had already sized him up from a distance. Mitchell hesitated at the entrance, the door clicking softly behind him. Carter's presence was commanding, even without a single word spoken. It was as if the man could see right through him, peeling back the layers of his defenses with nothing but a glance. Finally, Carter spoke without looking up. "Sit down." The command was simple, but there was a gravity to it that made Mitchell's legs feel like lead as he walked over to the table. He slid into the seat across from Carter, his breath shallow as the distance between them seemed to shrink. "Do you know why I'm here?" Carter asked, his voice calm but edged with something Mitchell couldn't quite place. It wasn't anger. It was something colder. Something more dangerous. I know why you're here," Mitchell said, trying to steady his voice. "I made a mistake. A huge mistake." He could feel his chest tighten as he spoke, the words coming out like they were being dragged from the deepest part of him. Carter leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto Mitchell's with an intensity that made him feel exposed. "Mistakes," he said slowly, each word deliberate, "are one thing. But this wasn't a mistake. This was a choice. A choice to act based on your own assumptions, your own biases, without even giving me the chance to prove myself." Mitchell's throat went dry. "I know. And I didn't mean to. I was wrong. I admit it. I've been wrong, Carter." Carter's lips curled into a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You're wrong about something else too, Officer Mitchell," he said, his voice dropping lower now. "You think this is just about a traffic stop. But it's not. This is about something far bigger than you. Far bigger than both of us." Mitchell's mind raced. "What are you talking about?" Carter leaned back in his chair, the quiet confidence in his posture sending a chill down Mitchell's spine. "You made a mistake last night, but I've been watching you for a while now, Mitchell. And this is only the beginning." He paused, his gaze piercing through Mitchell as if he were a piece of glass about to shatter. "You think you're the one in control, that you're the one with the power, but you've been blinded by your own arrogance. Your prejudice. You've built a shield around yourself that keeps you from seeing the bigger picture." Mitchell's head swam. What was Carter saying? This was about more than just the stop. Mitchell had always thought of himself as a good cop, professional, committed, just. But here Carter was, tearing him apart piece by piece, exposing the cracks in his armor. He could feel his stomach churn, the walls closing in. "Are you going to report me?" Mitchell asked, his voice barely a whisper. He didn't know why he asked it. Maybe because it was the one thing he needed to know, the one thing that could give him some clarity. Carter's eyes softened for a brief moment, but his voice remained steady. "What I do next isn't up to me, Mitchell. It's up to you. You're the one who has to decide if you want to keep living in a world where you wear that badge with pride, or if you're going to take it off and face the truth about who you really are." The silence between them stretched, heavy and suffocating. Mitchell could feel his hands trembling on the table, his pulse pounding in his ears. Carter wasn't just talking about the stop. He was talking about everything. The way Mitchell saw the world, the way he had let his biases shape his actions, the way he had failed to see the humanity in people who didn't look like him. Mitchell swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath, trying to grasp the gravity of what Carter was saying. What do you want from me?" Carter stared at him for a long time before finally speaking. "I want you to make a choice, Mitchell. A real one. Do you want to be part of the solution? Or do you want to be part of the problem?" The question hit Mitchell like a punch to the gut. He had never been forced to confront this, not like this. The weight of the decision, the weight of the truth, pressed down on him with the force of 1,000 storms. Carter stood up, his eyes never leaving Mitchell's. "You have 24 hours to figure it out. But know this, if you decide to ignore it, If you choose to stay in your little bubble of denial, there will be consequences. For both of us. Mitchell remained seated, the room spinning as Carter walked away, leaving him alone with his thoughts. The clock was ticking, and Mitchell knew he couldn't outrun this anymore. The question wasn't whether or not he would lose his badge, it was whether he would lose himself in the process. Mitchell sat in his patrol car, parked on the quiet side street, staring at his phone. The message from Carter was still there, lingering like a shadow. You have 24 hours. He couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. Every minute that passed felt like a countdown. He had to make a choice, but which one? The city outside was muted, its usual buzz dampened by the looming storm clouds above. The sky was heavy, a reflection of the weight in Mitchell's chest. The decision Carter had forced him into seemed more overwhelming by the second. The officer he'd once been, who wore his badge with pride, felt distant now. The man in the mirror was different, a man haunted by his own choices. He could ignore it, bury his head in the sand and pretend it never happened. But the truth had already found him, and running was no longer an option. The encounter with Carter had opened his eyes in a way he hadn't anticipated. He'd seen how deeply his biases had shaped his actions, his decisions. He'd seen how dangerous those biases were, not just to others, but to himself. The phone in his hand buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a call from Sergeant Hill. "Mitchell, what the hell is going on?" Hill's voice crackled through the receiver. "I just got a call from the FBI. They want answers." "What did you do last night?" Mitchell's stomach twisted, and his heart thudded loudly in his ears. He knew this was coming. There was no way to run now. "I need to come in," he said, his voice tight. "I have to explain everything." "Get here now," Hill snapped, the line going dead before Mitchell could say anything more. Mitchell's hands trembled as he started the car. He'd made a mistake. A big one. And now he had to face the consequences. Inside the station, the air felt thick with tension. As Mitchell walked down the narrow corridor toward Hill's office, he felt the eyes of his colleagues on him. Whispers followed in his wake, though no one dared approach him. He wasn't sure if they were judging him or waiting for something. Hill's office door was ajar when Mitchell arrived. The sergeant didn't look up from the paperwork scattered on his desk, his expression unreadable. "You're late," Hill said without a hint of warmth. Mitchell closed the door behind him and took a seat. The silence stretched out between them. Hill didn't need to ask, he already knew why Mitchell was there. The FBI had already been in contact, and Mitchell's reckless actions had put everyone in jeopardy. "I messed up," Mitchell began, his voice thick with regret. "I stopped that man, Agent Carter, for no reason. I judged him based on nothing but the color of his skin. And I can't pretend it didn't happen." Hill finally looked up, his gaze sharp. "You're telling me this now?" His tone was cold, cutting. "You think admitting it will make everything better? This is more than just a screw-up. You've put yourself and us at risk. You're talking about the FBI, Mitchell? They don't let things like this slide." Mitchell felt the weight of Hill's words like a punch to the gut. But he couldn't back down. He couldn't keep living in the shadow of his mistakes. "I know," he whispered, "but I have to make it right. I need to face it no matter what happens." Hill stared at him for a long moment, then exhaled sharply. "You know this could end your career, right?" "How? It could end more than that. The FBI isn't just going to let this go. They'll want to know everything. And when they do, it won't be just you on the line. It'll be us, too." Mitchell nodded. "I'm willing to face whatever comes. I need to talk to Agent Carter. I need to apologize. To explain myself." There was a pause before Hill finally spoke again, his voice low. You sure you want to do this? You're making a choice that you can't undo. If Carter presses charges, if they dig deeper, your life will never be the same. Mitchell's hands clenched into fists. I don't care what happens to me. I need to fix what I broke. Hill looked at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a heavy sigh, he stood and walked over to the file cabinet, pulling out a folder and tossing it on the desk in front of Mitchell. I'll make the call. But don't think for a second that I'm covering for you. If you screw this up, don't come running to me. Mitchell grabbed the folder, his fingers cold as they brushed over the papers inside. His fate was now tied to a decision that couldn't be undone. I won't screw it up, he said quietly, though even he wasn't sure if he believed it. The rest of the day was a blur. Hill made the call to the FBI, setting up a meeting with Agent Carter. Mitchell knew he had to face the consequences, but part of him dreaded what was to come. What if Carter didn't believe him? What if the FBI came down hard on him, exposed everything he'd done wrong? His mind raced as he prepared for the meeting. He couldn't stop thinking about what Carter had said. You have 24 hours. The clock was ticking, and it felt as if time was slipping away faster than he could catch it. Every decision now felt critical. Every word, every movement, every choice was magnified under the pressure of what was at stake. Finally, the time came. Mitchell drove to the meeting spot, his hands slick with sweat on the wheel. The streets outside seemed to blur by in a haze of gray, the world outside his car like a distant memory. The only thing that mattered now was what would happen when he stepped into that room with Agent Carter. Would he be able to make it right? Or would he pay the price for his mistakes? As Mitchell parked and walked toward the building, he took a deep breath. This was it. The moment of truth. His heart pounded in his chest, his thoughts racing. But in that moment, something inside him clicked. No matter the outcome, he had made the decision to face his wrongs. And in doing so, he had taken the first step toward redemption. The meeting spot was an unmarked building in a quiet part of town, tucked away between aging warehouses. The atmosphere felt heavy, almost suffocating. Mitchell's footsteps echoed on the cracked sidewalk as he approached the entrance, his heart beating in his throat. There was no turning back now. As he entered the building, a sharp scent of disinfectant hit him. The interior was dimly lit, sterile and cold, just like the reality he was facing. Carter was already there, sitting in a plain, metal chair at the far side of a long table. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet intensity that made Mitchell's stomach twist. Sit, Carter said simply, gesturing to the chair opposite him. Mitchell hesitated, then walked over and took a seat. The silence between them was palpable, and Mitchell could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, as if the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for him to speak. Carter was the first to break the stillness. You know why you're here. And you know what's at stake. So, let's get straight to it. What the hell were you thinking, pulling me over like that? Mitchell's throat went dry. He had practiced this moment in his head 100 times, but now that he was sitting here, facing Carter, he felt the full force of his mistakes. He had no excuse, no easy way out. He had to face the truth, no matter how painful. I don't know what came over me, Mitchell said, his voice low. I saw you, and I acted without thinking. I made assumptions based on nothing but prejudice. It was wrong. And I can't take it back, but I'm here to face the consequences. Carter's eyes narrowed, his expression still unreadable. You're lucky I didn't call in the whole force after you. You don't pull over an FBI agent without consequences. Do you understand the severity of what you've done? Mitchell nodded, swallowing hard. I do. And I'm ready to accept whatever comes my way. I know I messed up, but I'm trying to make it right. For a long moment, Carter didn't speak. He leaned back in his chair, staring at Mitchell, as if measuring him, trying to gauge his sincerity. Mitchell could feel the weight of his gaze, and every second stretched out like an eternity. The room seemed to close in on him, the air thick with tension. "You've been on the force long enough to know better," Carter finally said. "This isn't just about one bad decision. This is about a pattern. A pattern of racism, of bias that's ingrained so deep you don't even realize it. Do you really think I didn't know what you were doing when you pulled me over?" Mitchell's chest tightened. "I didn't realize it then. But I see it now. And I hate myself for it." Carter's eyes softened, just slightly. "You're not the only one, Mitchell. We're all responsible for the way things are. But you have a chance to make it right. Not just for yourself, but for everyone around you." Mitchell was silent for a long moment, absorbing Carter's words. This wasn't just about him anymore. It wasn't just about his career, his future. It was about something bigger, something that transcended the individual and reached into the very heart of the system he had sworn to uphold. "I don't want to be part of that system anymore," Mitchell said quietly. "Not if it means perpetuating this kind of injustice. I've seen enough. I want to change." Carter studied him for a long time, his gaze unwavering. Then, without another word, he stood up and walked over to a nearby filing cabinet. He opened it, retrieved a thick file, and dropped it onto the table in front of Mitchell. "This is your future," Carter said, his voice sharp. "You can either go back to your life and continue down the same path, pretending it never happened, or you can use what you've learned to make a real difference. It's up to you." Mitchell's eyes flicked down to the file, his hands trembling as he reached for it. Inside were documents, names, evidence of corruption, and more, things he never would have imagined. It was like he was holding the key to everything, to the truth that had been buried for so long. He knew what this meant. Carter wasn't just offering him a chance to redeem himself. He was giving him a choice to be part of something much bigger, to help expose the very system that had caused so much harm. But it came at a cost. A heavy one. "What do you want from me?" Mitchell asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your choice," Carter said. "You can walk away from this, forget it ever happened. But know that by doing that, you're complicit in the same system that has ruined lives. Or you can step up, help us expose the truth, and make sure it never happens again. It's not easy, and it's not safe. But it's the right thing to do." Mitchell's heart pounded in his chest. He had already made the decision, even though he hadn't fully admitted it to himself. His life had led him here, to this crossroads, and the weight of everything he had learned was too heavy to ignore. "All right," Mitchell said, his voice steady. "I'll do it. I'll help you expose it all." Carter nodded, his expression softening. "You're making the right choice." Mitchell stood up, the file clutched tightly in his hands. He knew that everything would change from this moment on. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and sacrifice. But he was ready. As he walked out of the building, Mitchell felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in years. He wasn't just walking away from his past mistakes. He was walking toward something bigger, a chance to make a real difference. The storm clouds above began to dissipate, and for the first time in a long while, Mitchell felt like he could breathe again. The future was still uncertain, but he wasn't facing it alone. And that was enough. As he drove away, the weight of the world on his shoulders, Mitchell knew that his journey was just beginning. There was no going back now. But in that moment he was ready to face whatever came next.